Hi, everyone. I'm Max Werner. I'm an associate professor of geophysics and natural hazards here at the University of Bristol and a member of the Cabot Institute for the Environment.
Oh, congratulations, you got promoted.
Thanks.
I'm Daniel Haynes. I'm senior lecturer in environmental history in the School of Humanities here at Bristol and a member of the Cabot Institute for the Environment as well.
So Dan, I was just reflecting a little bit on the first time we met, which I think is about 7 or 8 years ago. And I think we met at a coffee shop. One of the first things that happened when I came to Bristol was I found the Cabot Institute for the Environment. And I heard from someone that there was a guy over in history who's interested in earthquakes. And that turned out to be you. And so we were set up on a little academic date. And over coffee, I think we talked about earthquakes in South Asia. So I guess I just wanted to ask you, what drew you to earthquakes as a historian? How did you, cross that boundary?
Well, I was searching for things to teach in my first year as a lecturer at Bristol, and a friend of mine was doing her PhD on flooding in Pakistan, and I had a background in environmental history in South Asia, and I thought her PhD sounded way cooler than what I was working on at the time. So when I got here, I decided to teach a course on natural disaster history in South Asia, and I found out that there had been this earthquake in 1897, which you know well, the Shillong earthquake, which made the average ground level in the Shillong plateau lift up by 1 meter. And I'd never heard of this. I've been working on South Asian history for a good 7 or 8 or 9 years by that point. And I thought, how can I not know about this enormous earthquake? So I started looking into the topic, and turned out there were a bunch of other enormous earthquakes that I'd not heard of or barely heard of. And it really made me think, what impact did all these massive disasters have on people who lived there at the time, and why are they kind of missing from the mainstream narratives of what was going on in India in the early 20th century? And then my head of department at the time, who was a Cabot Institute affiliate and extremely enthusiastic about things, came to me and said, Dan, I met this new scholar in the Earth Sciences department who does earthquakes. You should go and have coffee. And so we did. And then that was the start of a beautiful friendship. And you also introduced me to various other people in earth sciences. So now I know lots of you.
Yeah, that was indeed the start. And of course, we'll talk a little bit about our adventures together since then. But I guess what first drew me to, I guess, you and history was really, trying to place, I study earthquakes minutely as a scientist. I think about the physics, I calculate quantities, I measure things, I study them in the field, in the lab sometimes, I look at them empirically, theoretically, and yet somehow, the prospect of looking at earthquakes through another person's eyes, and in particular, another academic's eyes, or someone who also thinks about them in a particular way, just sounded really intriguing to me, because it's, it just sort of shines a new light and provides a new perspective on this thing that I've been studying for now decades. And in particular, I guess, the sort of the intersection between the science and sort of, say the spatial footprint, or, how things move during an earthquake, and what, of course, the effects are, and also how that shapes, history. I think it's just, in a way, it's so much bigger than earthquakes themselves. So it's just such a rich, way to sort of rediscover earthquakes. So I guess that was sort of the first sort of, path in which I became interested in interdisciplinary work. But of course, out of that conversation, sort of spawned a project. And we had some initial ideas for what we wanted to do. What was your interest, I guess, in that first project?
There were various interests. I mean, one, Bhutan sounded lovely and I really wanted to go there, and this sounded like a great way to explore another part of South Asia and get into Himalayan research, which I'd previously been looking at the western side of South Asia, at Pakistan and Northwest India. And secondly, I really wanted the chance to work collaboratively with scientists, because I was a science geek when I was a kid. I always loved science, but I eventually went down the humanities route professionally, and this seemed like a great opportunity to sort of see what life might have been like if I was better at maths. With science. And then thirdly, the research problem that we went to the Brace project with just seemed really fascinating. How can we use these historical records, these amazing religious texts and biographical texts that are dispersed across Bhutan in zongs in all of these monasteries? Can we recover historical data from them that is useful to scientists in kind of doing real science about earthquake hazard? In other words, the way that earthquakes occur physically in that part of the Himalaya, and is there a real way to connect these otherwise quite esoteric seeming historical sources to present day decision making and policy making, sort of through the conduit of physical science?
I mean, that it sounds exactly, it sounds very similar to sort of the interest that I had in that project. So maybe for the other listeners here, the Brace project was funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, led by Francis Cooper, a senior lecturer here in Earth Sciences, also a member of the Cabot Institute. And it was a relatively short one-year project that allowed us to explore some historical documents and help us sort of constrain some data from historical documents in Bhutan that would be relevant for learning more about earthquakes that have happened in Bhutan in the past, and help us constrain models or probabilities of future earthquakes in that region. And we had a number of different collaborators, of course, from the Royal University of Bhutan, Raju Sarkar, Dr. Drukpa from the Ministry of Geology and Mines, Francis Harris, Fergus Lyons, and a few others. And of course, I completely share the excitement of working in Bhutan, a country that has very different sort of indicators of progress, the Gross National Happiness Index, basically replacing what I think most other countries focus on, which tends to be GDP. It was the prospect of working there and visiting and then of course collaborating with historians and social scientists and placing all of that into scientific context once we had that information was just thrilling.
Well, what's the thing you remember most clearly from that fieldwork time in Bhutan?
Oh, I remember many things. One particular joy was, of course, the film that you and I made, Dan, where we were asked by the Royal Tutorial Project to make a film about history and earthquakes, and how we were basically we were filming in traditional Bhutanese outfits in an old monastery, a zong, and spoke in a little bit of a wooden fashion maybe to the camera about earthquakes and the role that history has in bringing new scientific information to light. That's certainly one of the highlights for me. How about you?
I think for me, it's got to be, apart from the film, which was great, it's got to be when we were in the zong on the hillside outside Punakha in Western Bhutan. And we were speaking with the monks there, who had an original manuscript copy of the 9th J. Kempo's autobiography. So an autobiography written by a very senior religious figure in Bhutan from the early 18th century, in which he described experiencing the 1714 earthquake as a small child, and describes it in quite significant detail. And being there with you and having someone who was able to really understand what the parameters of the physical science were, what can the source tell us about the science, at the same time that I was asking the traditional historians questions like, what's the provenance of this source? Is there a possibility of transcription errors? What was the social and political context of Bhutan at the time? And putting those two things together, I mean, being in the conversation at the same time was really, really instructive, I thought. And at the same time, the incredible welcome and friendliness that we got from the monks in the Zong, who really responded very positively to us turning up and saying, have you got any historical records? Can we talk to you about them?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a joy. And I think that joy was really shared by the monks that we were talking to, because they were very enthusiastic about talking to us about earthquakes and the ground shaking and sort of other natural phenomena that would show up in historical texts. And of course, we would look at them through different eyes. I think in some of their descriptions, these events were symbols for events of great spiritual importance. And in many ways, earthquakes can be those moments. Of course, they can be disasters and they can be tragic. But they can also be experienced in a very different way, especially when they're sort of observed at safe distance. And of course, as a scientist, I saw these descriptions as data, and that data is hard to come by for earthquakes before about 100 years ago. The first seismometers were really only developed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so we've really only been systematically, if you like, seismologically measuring earthquakes routinely since the start, 1910s, 1920s or so. Having these colleagues across the different disciplines and having broad, far-ranging discussions around, what in the end is actually generating the impact of an earthquake was really, I really learned a lot, and it opened my eyes to other ways of helping people connect with the threat. As a scientist, I like to talk about the earthquake as a scientific phenomenon. But actually, through art, through through media and other tools, you can get people's attention in a way that science can't. And so it's very powerful tools for building resilience that, as a seismologist, are not in my immediate toolkit, if you like.
I do think that seismologists and other earth scientists are really good science communicators, though. And this wasn't something I appreciated before I started working with you and with other earth scientists that I've encountered in other contexts, because people would often say to me while having project meetings or planning for research grants and that sort of thing, that they wanted humanities scholars involved, historians like me, because we understand people and we understand culture and that sort of thing. But actually, you guys have been doing it for decades. Scientists are really quite sophisticated, earth scientists at any rate, are really quite sophisticated in the way that you communicate physical processes and earth processes and why it all matters. So I think I've learned a huge amount actually from stepping into that world in which the kind of work you do is so much more immediately applicable to real world problems than most academic history, certainly the kind of academic history that I'd been doing before. So I would certainly say that although you might feel as a seismologist your scope is quite narrow, I think you're part of a community of scholars who have learned a lot of the important lessons about how to translate that kind of academic knowledge into the real world. I learned from work that I did after our collaborative project finished. I went on to do a more traditional history project where I wasn't working with scientists, but I was very inspired by the kind of conversations we'd had and what I'd learned from working with you and the others on Brace. And I was looking at early 20th century and late 19th century earthquakes across what was at the time British India. So in modern terms, India, Pakistan, Myanmar, and also Nepal, which was independent. And so much of the impact of the earthquakes I was looking at was actually not the ground shaking and the buildings collapsing. That was, of course, one of the main sources of mortality and damage and catastrophic in all the ways that you'd expect if, like me, you grew up in the 90s watching disaster movies. But actually it was water that was the surprising sort of wildcard factor that I hadn't been expecting to see before those conversations with you and Francis and Byron. Because so often it was floods, changes in river levels, damage to agricultural land, and the associated health impacts of flooding, which really were responsible for a lot of deaths. So in 1897, that same earthquake that we discussed, the Shillong earthquake, the official death count in India was about 1,500. So that's the number of people that the government attributed, the number of people who died, and the government attributed that directly to the earthquake. So people on whom buildings collapsed and were otherwise caught up in that initial period of shaking. But if you go through the provincial reports for the next couple of years, it becomes clear that 33,000 people died in a cholera epidemic shortly after the earthquake. And although I didn't find corroborating evidence, the officials who are writing the reports thought that the cholera epidemic had broken out because of the flooding that the earthquake had caused. And another earthquake in 1950 in nearly the same region, again, caused severe flooding, which lasted for at least 10 years. I only tracked it through the archive for the following 10 years, but significantly more severe flooding for a good 10 years. And so earthquakes have all these spillover effects that link up very closely with what we see in climate change, which broadly speaking is less stable precipitation, so more flooding and more droughts, especially in South Asia and the Himalaya. And this really made me think that when we're discussing earthquakes and how to build resilience against earthquakes, we've really got to bear in mind these longer term effects that are harder to see if you just think of an earthquake as the few minutes of shaking that collapses buildings, and that actually they have these much longer term or even medium term, in an intensive sense, impacts on the landscape and therefore also impacts on the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, over the long term, there's some really interesting, complicated questions around how climate and erosion and mountain building all form one system together to change landscapes and affect there's all sorts of cross connections between these in the much longer term. So yeah, that's certainly a really interesting field of study. I was interested in sort of a specific question because I study one aspect I study about earthquakes is that they never come alone, right? They always bring with them all their aftershocks, and sometimes those aftershocks are larger than the earthquake, that we call the main shock. And I was interested in your studies. Did you sort of said you tracked sort of this the impact of this Shillong and the 1950 Assam earthquake through the years? Was there evidence of strong aftershocks that followed that maybe weren't recorded seismically? Is that something that crops up in these documents?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember, Max. Let's cut that out, shall we? What was I saying? So, okay, so I'm trying to remember specifics, and it's a while since I've had a chance to look in detail at the archives. Yeah, so one thing I really learned from you is to rethink the definition of what an earthquake is, because I'd always thought of foreshocks and aftershocks as subsidiary to the main earthquake, what I would think of as the main earthquake. And you explained to me that from your point of view, every shock is a separate earthquake and they come in sequences. And that makes what we term the earthquake is basically a human choice. It's usually related to the fact that it was the biggest one that did the most damage out of the sequence of shocks. But it's still an act of naming. It's not something that comes from nature, it's something that comes from society. And there were definitely numerous recorded fore and aftershocks in all of the earthquakes that I looked at historically. And in fact, if you read accounts of the 1950 earthquake, which was up in what is now called Arunachal Pradesh, in the borderlands between India and China, the main shock occurred at about, I think it was 8 p.m. or maybe 10 p.m. But substantial aftershocks were going on right until dawn broke the next day. And the actual impact on people who experienced that was really, really profound, because once the main shocks happened, people were then frightened and really prone to overreact, in inverted commas. From their point of view, it's quite rational to go out of the building when you felt another shock, because you didn't know if it was going to be another really, really big shock that was likely to collapse the building. But it really made me think, from the point of view of people who live through earthquakes, how does it all feel and how does it fit together as an experience? And although this isn't something I have the knowledge and expertise to have a professional opinion on, what is the kind of mental health implication of living through an earthquake, and the way it changes people's relationship with landscape? Because it's pretty clear from accounts from Quetta, which is now in Western Pakistan, where there was a really big earthquake in 1935 that affected a very big British community, because it was a garrison town. There were lots of British soldiers there and their families. And it really transformed the way that these people talked about Quetta, which is quite high. It's about 5,000 feet elevation. So it had, from a British point of view, quite pleasant seasons. It was relatively cool in the summer. It snowed in the winter. There were a lot of Brits around, so they had a sort of familiar social life with tennis courts and dances and so on. And the earthquake happened, and from then on, Quetta is really described as a place of devastation, and a lot of fear is attached to the physical environment there, particularly landslips. So post-earthquake landslips, some of which were generated directly by major aftershocks, and some of which were just destabilized slopes that eventually collapsed. But there are numerous accounts of how frightening it was to see and hear these landslips, which were happening outside the city. So the observers I'm talking about weren't in any danger, but still those psychological impacts of surviving an earthquake really stuck with people and had important impacts on their lives.
Yeah.
So really, mental health is one of the, I think, the aspects of earthquake resilience and recovery that we really need to think about, arguably even more than we already do. It takes a long time to get going. And I think from that initial coffee shop meet that you and I had, I think it was a good couple of years before we started talking to Francis Cooper and cooking up the idea for what eventually became the Brace Project, assuming I'm remembering correctly. And it was really the environment that the Cabot Institute fostered, that culture of being able to meet up and have conversations, these kinds of interdisciplinary conversations, go to social mingles and go to seminars and so on, and keep meeting people and keep talking to each other. That I think gave us the space to develop a relationship, which meant that when the opportunity came around, the funding opportunity, we were kind of ready to go for it. So I think we'd had the idea sometime before, and we were waiting for an appropriate funding scheme to come up.
So I think that, yeah, that highlights a couple of issues that are also on my mind. One is there's not much funding for interdisciplinary work, and there are few venues for building trusting collaborations. So the Cabot Institute is really quite unique in that sense. At the various different universities that I've been to before, I can't think of one that had one that so enthusiastically embraced interdisciplinarity, and that's what drew me to the University of Bristol, in addition to other factors. So there's often, we tend to sit in our silos in our schools and departments and faculties, and the administrative way in which we work makes it difficult to, I think, find like-minded or differently minded academics and that we can have useful, productive exchanges with.
Do earthquake scientists still make any use of observational data, as in just people who've seen earthquakes happen or experienced them? Does that feed in at all anymore?
Oh yeah, a lot. In fact, increasingly so again with social media and mobile phones. So in a whole variety of ways, I think citizens, the public, citizen science, the public have become much more involved again in data collection than they have been in the past. Partially that's because apps might be monitoring shaking. So specific seismological apps on your phone might be recording earthquakes. People are also encouraged to go and fill out questionnaires on the web after an earthquake, so-called "Did you feel it?" databases. So for us, that's a great source of information because we don't have seismometers everywhere, and there's a lot of people, and a lot of them have phones, and so when they give us information about how strong the shaking was that they perceived, that helps us constrain, let's say, the spatial footprint of the seismic waves that traveled outward. That helps us constrain maybe the damage outline of a major earthquake, and it also helps us. Social scientists are also starting to study that data because under certain circumstances, people are much more perceptive of the ground shaking than in others. So this links, for instance, with human-induced seismicity, such as seismicity induced by deep geothermal exploration or shale gas development, hydraulic fracturing, or commonly known as fracking. When those little, usually small earthquakes are induced, the way that people record them is quite different from the population of Los Angeles reacting to yet another magnitude 2.5 that occurs quite frequently. So these are interesting data sets, not quite the eyewitness accounts of that would have been collected by the Geological Survey of India after the 1897 Shillong earthquake. But certainly sort of the data that we can gather from people, especially people with phones, is really having quite an impact on the discipline again.
My key takeaway, which is just to remind us that to solve the problems that are posed by things like earthquakes and climate change, you really need to bring together scientific data and infrastructure with people. And that goes for the solutions that we look at, so building people into resilience plans, but also the way we generate data, that we really need this kind of interdisciplinary work that can draw on lots of different types of information and try and synthesize it to say something helpful. And that fundamentally there's no such thing as a technical solution to earthquakes or to climate change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Dan. That was really well said. I completely agree that these complex problems require interdisciplinary solutions. We need support for finding those interdisciplinary solutions that can be in the form of institutes that facilitate connections between, in our case, a historian and a seismologist, and many others. And we need support, of course, for funding our partners overseas and as well as locally. And we need sustained funding. And we need universities to recognize the importance of interdisciplinary work and to facilitate that between our different academic silos. And finally, maybe, our work together has really opened my eyes to the myriad ways in which, natural phenomena interact with society and humans, and how humans, shape the environment for such that natural phenomena, have different effects. It's a very complex, interacting, system, and the effect of earthquakes just sort of ripple through this very complicated environmental infrastructure system, and it's very difficult to pinpoint the exact ways in which future earthquakes might have disastrous outcomes. But we need to study the entire system as a whole, and we need to understand to what extent climate change and how climate change will affect even this complicated interaction.